Welcome. My name is Miss Noreen, and I'm here for another exciting lesson in ELA. Today's lesson focus will be ELA Grade 3, Module 12, Lesson 1, Into Reading Literary Text Traditional Tales. The focus question will be, what are the characteristics of traditional tales? Follow along with me, boys and girls, as I read the lesson objectives. Recognize and describe characteristics of traditional tales. Analyze texts for characteristics of traditional tales. Boys and girls, today we will be focusing on the elements of traditional tales. We will focus more closely on folk tales. We will be watching a short video on a tale. As you watch this video, I want you to pay close attention to what you notice is happening in this tale and what makes it special and different from other types of stories. Here we go.
This is the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived in a village near a big forest. Her grandmother had made her a beautiful red cloak with a big red hood, which she wore every time she went outside. And so everyone in the village called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day, Little Red Riding Hood's mother said,
Grandma isn't feeling very well. Will you take this basket of food through the forest to her cottage?
Yes, Mother.
said Little Red Riding Hood.
I sure would love to see Grandma.
She put on her red cloak and she pulled up her red hood and she took the basket of food into the forest.
Remember,
Her mother called after her.
don't talk to any strangers along the way.
I won't.
Little Red Riding Hood promised, and she skipped down the path and into the woods. Little Red Riding Hood did not have to worry about getting lost in the forest because she knew the way to Grandma's house very well. But along the way, she saw some beautiful wild flowers growing near the path.
I bet Grandma would really love these.
She said to herself, and she stopped to pick a few.
Hello, little girl,
Said a deep, growling voice from behind her. Little Red Riding Hood was very startled. She spun around and saw a big bad wolf standing in the shadows between two trees.
Hello.
Said Little Red Riding Hood. She didn't know that the wolf was bad, and she had already forgotten her mother's words about talking to strangers.
Where are you going on this fine day?
Asked the big bad wolf.
I'm going to my Grandma's cottage on the other side of the forest.
Said Little Red Riding Hood.
She isn't feeling very well, so I'm bringing her this basket of food and these flowers.
What a sweet girl you are,
Said the big bad wolf. He smiled and showed his mouthful of sharp teeth. The big bad wolf was quite hungry, and he was not interested in the basket of food.
I had better be going.
Said Little Red Riding Hood,
Bye.
and she skipped off down the path. The big bad wolf's stomach grumbled and growled with hunger, and suddenly he had an idea. As quick as he could, he ran through the forest all the way to Grandma's cottage. The sneaky wolf opened the door very quietly and found Grandma asleep in her bed. He picked up the old woman, opened his great big mouth, and he swallowed poor Grandma in one gulp. Then the big bad wolf climbed into the bed and pulled the blanket up to his chin. He put on Grandma's glasses and her nightcap, and he waited for the little girl to arrive with her flowers and basket of food. When Little Red Riding Hood arrived at the cottage, she opened the door quietly and found Grandma lying in bed.
Hello, Grandma.
She said,
Mother told me you weren't feeling well, so I brought some food and some flowers. Do you like them?
What a sweet little girl you are.
said the wolf in his fake grandma voice.
Come closer, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood took a step closer and she noticed that something looked a little different about Grandma.
My,
She said,
what big eyes you have, Grandma.
All the better to see you with.
said the big bad wolf.
Come closer, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood took another step closer to the bed.
My,
She said,
what big ears you have, Grandma.
All the better to hear you with.
replied the wolf.
Come closer, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood took one more step closer.
My, what big teeth you have, Grandma.
She said in surprise.
All the better to eat you with.
Growled the big bad wolf. He jumped out of the bed, and as he opened his great big mouth, Little Red Riding Hood shrieked and tried to run, but the hungry wolf grabbed her up and swallowed Little Red Riding Hood in just one gulp. Outside the cottage, a woodsman happened to be walking through the forest when he heard Little Red Riding Hood's shriek of surprise. He hurried inside and he saw the wolf with his huge round belly. The woodsman grabbed the big bad wolf, turned him upside down and shook him by his feet. Little Red Riding Hood came tumbling out of the wolf's mouth and Grandma followed. The three of them chased the big bad wolf out of the cottage, out of the forest and over the hill. The big bad wolf ran for his life and was never seen again. Little Red Riding Hood learned her lesson and she never, ever talked to strangers again. The end.
Okay, boys and girls, what are some things you noticed about the story of Little Red Riding Hood? What did you notice about the characters, the setting, the problem, the solution, and what lesson did we learn from this story? Keep that in mind because we will be coming back to this story later in the lesson. So boys and girls, let's go over some of the elements of a folk tale. What is a folk tale? Folk tales were passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth, which is called oral tradition. Can you say that with me? Oral tradition. Folk tales were made up to explain the wonders of the world or to teach morals and lessons. Trickster tales, boys and girls. In a trickster tale, one character, usually the protagonist, is a clever trickster that causes problems for the other characters. Fables. These are stories that teach a lesson or have a moral. The main characters of fables are usually animals with human characteristics. The moral is never stated, but needs to be inferred, which means that you have to figure it out by the reader. Examples of some fables are the tortoise and the hare and the ant and the grasshopper. Pourquoi stories. They explain why something is as it is, and it explains how something came to be and is usually explains something in nature. Fairy tales, my favorite type of tales. They include good and evil characters, usually has a hero or a heroine, has magic, often begins with once upon a time, and the conflicts are resolved through kindness, courage, or intelligence. Some examples of fairy tales are Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Aladdin. The elements of a traditional tale. Let's find out what those are. Here are the elements of some of the traditional tales. Usually the purpose of tales is to entertain. The characters may be animals or people with superhuman or magical abilities. The setting is usually not like real life. The plot has a conflict and resolution, but the events may not happen in real life. They include a plot with a setting, characters, and a sequence of events. They often include a moral or a lesson that is learned. Some examples of these lessons can be kind to others, be aware of flatterers, and don't give up. They may be like a folk tale, a legend, a myth, a tall tale, a fable, or a fairy tale, as we learned earlier. And they may include figurative language to describe characters or events. So all these are elements of traditional tales, boys and girls. Okay, boys and girls, we said that we would go back to this story, the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Now think back to the video we watched in the beginning of the lesson. Now we're going to take the elements of a fairy tale and we are going to match them with the story that we just read. We're going to match the characters, setting, problem, solution, and moral. And remember, moral is the lesson that we learn in a story. So here are some of the things that we have on the right side that we have to match. So we have forest. The wolf wanted to eat Little Red Riding Hood. The woodsman saved Little Red Riding Hood. Do not trust strangers. Little Red Riding Hood, wolf, grandma, and woodsman. Go ahead, boys and girls, pause this video and see if you can match the elements with the correct details from the story of the Little Red Riding Hood. Come back to the video to check your answers. Okay, boys and girls, here are the correct answers. For characters, it was Little Red Riding Hood, Grandma, and the wolf and the woodsman. The setting was the forest. The problem was that the wolf wanted to eat Little Red Riding Hood. The solution was that the woodsman saved Little Red Riding Hood. And the moral, the lesson of the story is do not trust strangers. If you got all those correct, give yourself a pat on the back because you did an awesome job with matching the elements with the different details. Okay, let's continue, boys and girls. Now we're going to try this together. We're going to hear another story, another tale, and we are going to try to figure out the different elements of that tale that we have just seen. The tale that we will be reading is called The Princess and the Pea. Remember, tales have different elements, characters, settings, problems, solution, sequence of events, and there's usually a lesson that's learned. So pay attention to those elements as you hear this story. Let's start reading this story. The Princess and the Pea.
The Princess and the Pea. A long time ago, in a place not too far from here, there was a prince who began to feel lonely. So he decided that he wanted to find a wife. However, his wife could not be just anyone. He was destined to marry a princess, a real princess. The prince searched all around the world, and though he found many who claimed to be princesses, he never felt convinced. Something was always not quite right, so he returned home without a wife. One evening, after the prince had returned, there was a terrible storm. Shockingly, in the midst of this horrible storm, there was a knock at the door. The king went to see who would dare travel in this awful weather. To everyone's surprise, it was a princess. She was beautiful, but she did not look like a princess. Her hair and clothes were soaked through, and even her shoes were filled with water. Nonetheless, she promised she was a real princess. "Well, we shall soon find out," said the queen. She had a plan to find out if this girl was a true princess. The queen went into the guest chambers and removed all the bedding and placed a single pea below the mattress. She then placed 20 more mattresses on top of the pea and 20 feather beds on top of the mattresses. It looked quite comfortable, although it made the bed 20 feet high. The princess was then shown where she was to sleep for the night. Upon seeing the bed, she was a little taken aback, but she carefully climbed up the mattresses and settled in for the night. The next morning, the queen was quite eager to ask the princess how she had slept. But before the queen could even finish asking the question, the young princess interrupted her. "Oh, Horribly, she cried out. I hate to complain after you made such an effort to make me comfortable, but I hardly closed my eyes. Goodness knows what was in that bed, but there was something round and hard that bothered me all night. The princess had passed the test. The queen confirmed that she was indeed a real princess. Only a true princess would be so sensitive. The prince was overjoyed to finally find his princess. He wanted to marry her at once. The princess had other ideas. She chose to get to know the prince first, which she did. In good time, the two fell in love and were married and lived happily ever after. And the pea was placed in the gallery of miraculous things and can still be seen to this day. The end.
Okay, boys and girls, how did you like that tale of the princess and the pea? Did you make sure to look out for the different elements of the tale, the setting, the characters, the problem, the solution, and the lesson that was learned in the story? Well, now it's time for your independent work part of this lesson. Keeping that story in mind, you will be filling out this graphic organizer. It will help you retell the tale that you just saw. You will write down the characters. You will write down the plot, which is what happened in the beginning, middle, and end. You will write down the problem and the solution in the story, and also what message or moral that was learned from watching or reading this story. Okay, boys and girls, to summarize what we did today. Today we learned about traditional tales. There are different types of traditional tales, which include folk tales, tall tales, fairy tales, fables. All these are examples of traditional tales. We also learned how to identify the different elements in traditional tales, such as characters, setting, plot, problem, solution, and moral of a tale. This is Miss Noreen logging off. Thank you so much for watching, boys and girls, and happy learning.